You've roped in Tony Martel, a PhD candidate in development studies at Nelson Mandela University, to discuss this further. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon, Tony. So just in light of what we've heard from the KwaZulu-Natal Premier Thami Ntuli announcing that, of course, the province's climate change adaptation plan follow his visit to the US. I mean, how significant are these collaborations with various countries and some of the things that they come up with, especially when you look at the different solutions that are unique to the various countries due to the weather patterns?
Thank you for having me. So I think that obviously in the news in the United States at the current moment, there was a devastating hurricane that was twice in size and diameter of Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Helene, and it's wreaked havoc across the east coast of the United States, particularly North Carolina. So I'm sure that in terms of technologies like early diagnostic warning systems for tracking weather patterns and the such is very important to learn from other countries. But then the other aspect of traveling to the United States to learn more about how the United States approaches these issues involves as well investment and finance for some of these strategies that South Africa might potentially apply. And I mean, thinking also about the United States, we can't forget about Hurricane Katrina and the devastation that it caused, and the role that the federal agency FEMA played, which was a remarkably underwhelming response to that crisis. And it was actually everyday people organizing together who actually played a monumental role in saving a lot of people in that city. So with that in mind, I think that a response from the KZN Premier to deal with issues like the snowstorm that just hit a few weeks ago would involve looking at climate issues as societal issues, and that climate events exacerbate existing societal problems. So, I mean, dealing with planning for when weather events might occur and how best to respond is one thing that can be done. But another thing that can be done is to look at long-term planning and dealing with much broader issues that affect society as a whole.
Absolutely.
Particularly in KwaZulu-Natal with...
Yeah, absolutely, Tony. I mean, that was going to be my second question then in terms of that, you know, especially with South Africa's rainy season now ahead of us and all this talk about, you know, climate change. The question then becomes, you know, how important it is for government to ready itself and also to plan ahead, but also incorporating the various stakeholders, especially given, as you've also just indicated, the growing threat, you know, of extreme weather. So in other words, then what then should the long-term plans be in terms of climate adaptation strategies, you know, that South African provinces like KwaZulu-Natal and even the Eastern Cape should adopt to mitigate, you know, the impacts of these disasters? Yeah,
certainly. Talking about drought, we're talking about rain bombs, we're talking about other weather-related events like tornadoes, cyclones, and these can have devastating effects in short periods of time. We're also talking about much broader things like agriculture, agricultural practices, urban reform. I mean, if we're thinking about what's happened just this year, the temperatures in Arizona right now at night are not reaching below 80 degrees Fahrenheit. If you are in a context in which the temperature does not drop below 80 degrees Fahrenheit for more than 2 weeks, you can die. And we've also seen in different parts of the world, like Iran, Cairo, and Egypt, and in India, major cities, major metropolitan areas with millions of people living in a context in which it's reaching upwards of 40 to 60 degrees Celsius. So we can talk about a rain bomb and what devastation that can pose on a population, but with heat, you can have thousands of people die in a matter of hours. So in the township context or in informal settlements, there is very little vegetation, and vegetation like trees are crucial to soaking up heat and providing shade. So we have to talk about massive urban reform. The fact that, the majority of South Africans live in townships and urban settlements. So in order to, and this is tantamount as well to agricultural practices. We can see in the Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal conventional agricultural practices using heavy machinery, chemical fertilizers, and pesticides desiccating the land. So, if you go to the rural Eastern Cape and the former Transkei, you can see how dry the soil is. So it's in the early stages of becoming a desert. What we need is to have broad spatial planning that does not just focus on a rural context or an urban context, but to bring together town and country so that we can have suitable places for people to live, but also that those suitable places for people to live are in a socioeconomic sense, but also in terms of climate. And that's why, obviously, climate is itself a societal issue, because it exacerbates these impacts that are already there for people. One other thing I'll mention as well, just to point it out, is that cities, there's many people, because of socioeconomic conditions, who are moving into urban places like Gqeberha. But cities in themselves are desertification machines. They pump water from, where Groendal Dam in the case of Eastern Cape, or Lesotho, into the ocean. And so that has to do with the social relations that come from the way in which people live and are organized in urban contexts. Yeah.
And I mean, Tony, just as we wrap out our conversation, of course, let's talk about then the role of disaster preparedness. I mean, we've seen how other countries have handled it much better because of the extreme weather patterns that they've had to deal with in the long term. But this also becomes important for South Africa. I mean, what gaps should our disaster teams then respond to better or better be improved?
In terms of disaster response, of course, you would have to have a sufficient public expenditure and a sufficient bureaucracy to handle, whatever predictive capabilities are there for learning in advance how the size and the impact of a particular weather event. But again, it's only applicable insofar as you've done planning in advance to cope with, how much of an impact something like this can have. Because if you have a lot of people who are already vulnerable, you're only going to be picking up the pieces. And I think that disaster response starts much earlier. And I think South Africa, in particular, with this climate council that the KZN Premier is proposing, should be looking at in a short term, a medium term, and a much longer term strategy to make KZN on all respects, because they all are implicated in climate events, in socioeconomic terms, in spatial terms, so that people from a much earlier stage will not even be put into a position in which the disaster could drastically affect their lives.
And those spatial terms are quite important, Tony. But thank you so much for your insights. Really do appreciate you coming on to the show. Tony Martel, their PhD candidate in development studies at Nelson Mandela University, just unpacking then the climate change in this country.